November 13, 1944. Hurtgen Forest, Germany. It was the deadliest patch of woods Americans ever fought in, 50 square miles of fog, frostbite, landmines, and German machine gun nests camouflaged in a tangle of pine and death. The 28th Infantry Division called it the meat grinder. The Germans called it Die Todesfall, the death trap. And somewhere in that haunted forest, Sergeant Thomas Hale, a coal miner's son from the hills of West Virginia, crouched alone on Hill 232, the last breathing soul in his shattered squad. For 3 excruciating hours, he fought off waves of German infantry, a Flammenpanzer flamethrower tank, and freezing rain, with nothing but a bar rifle, 6 magazines, and the memory of a promise he made to his younger brother before shipping out. They said no one could hold that hill. But no one told Tom Hale. Before this day was over, German officers would record enemy sniper activity at extreme levels, unaware it wasn't a sniper, it was a single stubborn American who refused to die. Like and subscribe for more true and untold WW2 stories that reveal the bravery buried in history's harshest places. Because sometimes, the loneliest battles tell the most powerful truths. It was the kind of morning only folks from the mountains would understand, mist hanging low on the pines, the air rich with wood smoke and echoes of something older than war. Sergeant Thomas Hale sat cross-legged against a fence post at the rear of a Belgian farm near the Luxembourg border, scratching lines into his battered canteen with the edge of a mess kit spoon. TH+EH+ Rodell, West Virginia. A carving, barely visible, but carried like scripture. The last E stood for Ezra, his younger brother, 17 and still growing into his boots the last time Tom saw him. Ezra had tried to follow him to war, forged a signature too, but Mama caught the lie. Tom made a promise before he boarded that troop train in Charleston, "I'll come back with both of us." His voice had shaken when he said it. Not out of fear of dying, but fear of breaking that promise. The 28th Infantry Division had seen rotation time near Luxembourg after the meat grinder of Normandy, but even rest here never felt restful. No picnic blankets, no laughter, just frost on the boots each morning and a strange stillness creeping through the trees. Tom's platoon, part of the 112th Regiment, filled sandbags and patched boots while rumors of a push into Germany grew louder. A kid from Kansas, eyes too wide to be holding a rifle, asked Hale once if it ever slowed down. "Not out here," Tom had muttered, watching a curl of breath vanish in front of him. "Not unless something worse is waiting." The boy didn't ask again. And yet in rare moments, there was peace. That morning Tom pulled a letter from his inside pocket, the folds worn soft and smudged with ash. In perfect penmanship, Ezra wrote about the mountain hollow back home. The deer were moving early, the trees had turned burnished copper, and Dad's old hound still barked at squirrels like it owed him money. Tom read it slowly, lips moving silently with each word. He carried it in his chest next to a torn photo of the two of them standing knee-deep in the mud of a West Virginia creek. Ezra, grinning as Tom held up a trout. Those days felt carved from another lifetime, and somehow closer than the men in foxholes around him. Most evenings under gray skies, when the firelight flickered near their boots, Hale would dig out a rusted harmonica and play, "I'll Be Seeing You." The melody floated through the trees, sorrowful and low, like the last notes of home drifting over an ocean of broken glass. The men didn't talk during the tune, only nodded, or closed their eyes. Hale never said much afterwards either. What needed saying had already left his breath inside that song. And perhaps that was his quiet gift, giving everyone around him permission to feel human for a moment before the next order came down. Some had nicknames like Tex or Philly. Tom was just Hale. Coal dust still clung like a spirit to the seams of his voice. He walked with the kind of deliberate stillness that made men listen. Those hunting trips in the Appalachians, hours of silence in freezing wind, lying belly down waiting for movement, they had trained him for this life without intending to. Patience, his father used to say. The woods answer in quiet. And war, Tom realized, had no louder enemy than silence. It crept in between artillery barrages, behind frostbitten lips, in the seconds after a letter ended but before a man folded it shut. By late October, the leaves had mostly turned black under frost, and Company B's gear smelled of mildew and rust. Supply lines barely kept up with the pace. American tanks were bogged down by forest trails so narrow 2 jeeps couldn't pass side by side. Hale noticed how the sergeant spoke more softly now and the mail calls grew less frequent. He wasn't a strategist, never claimed to be one, but years underground had taught him to feel shifts that others missed. And something was shifting now. Without a word from intel, a name began floating among the men like cigarette smoke: Hurtgen. A godless stretch of woods somewhere across the German border. They said it made Bastogne look like a summer picnic. Dense pine thickets, minefields, elevation shifts, and worse. Germans dug in so deep they might as well have been born there. Hale heard it mentioned once by a captain with a face chiseled from fatigue: no line. No front. Just trees. And bodies. The folks back home, Tom knew, had no idea what that meant, what it would cost to fight in a place like that. Still, Hale had no illusions. He didn't fight for generals or flags or speeches. He fought to get back to a boy with too big a heart and not enough years to break it alone. Ezra couldn't come here, so Tom carried both of them on his back. That promise, simple as it sounded, had weight. Weight heavier than any bar rifle or field pack slung over his shoulders. What he didn't yet see, what none of them saw, was that the woods they'd soon enter wouldn't just break bodies, they'd starve memories, silence radios, eat at souls until names were forgotten beneath the rot. Over 33,000 American casualties would happen in that forest alone. And Tom Hale was about to become one of its ghosts, before he ever fired a shot. The first snow came softly, like the quiet footfalls of something ancient moving among the trees. It fell in thin, drifting flakes over the helmets and shoulders of B Company as they stood gathered near the edge of the call trail. November 10, 1944. Somewhere between the Belgian border and a nightmare. Hale looked skyward as it started, fine crystals clinging to his eyelashes. "Ain't deer season anymore," muttered a man from Alabama beside him. Tom didn't answer. His breath frosted heavy, his hands buried inside wool gloves he'd stolen off a wounded German back in October. Supplies were thin. Ammunition was late. Socks were gold. The cold never asked permission. And neither did the orders that followed. Late that evening, as darkness fell like a curtain over the world, the regimental order came down in blotchy mimeograph ink: the 112th Infantry Regiment was to push into the Hurtgen forest. Objective: seize and hold Hill 232, near the village of Wassenack. It sounded straightforward on paper, but even on the map the lines looked like someone had scribbled into a coffin. A captain explaining the plan used the word wiggle room, and a lieutenant snapped that there wouldn't be any in that forest, only trees, blood, and mines. Every man in the room had heard the rumors: 8 American divisions chewed up since October. Nearly 24,000 casualties already. And they were sending another in. Hale unfolded the terrain sketch. Hill 232 was a knuckled rise in the middle of twisted trails, dense pine, and German strongpoints with overlapping fields of fire. No tanks could move through the woods. Visibility dropped to 20 yards in most places. The thick underbrush made radio signals unreliable. And the Germans, knowing every contour, had pre-sighted their artillery to strike pathways and ridgelines. Deadfall and barbed wire littered the slope. A quarter-mile hill. That's all. But it might as well have been Everest wrapped in fog with snipers waiting at every ledge. And that fog never lifted, not even at midday. To make matters worse, it had rained for 3 straight nights before the order came. Mud pulled at boots like hands. Men's socks froze stiff by morning. Jeeps spun out on roads that barely qualified as paths. Even sleeping now was a luxury, half-rotted dugouts and ponchos over shallow holes. Hale's squad, 6 men, 1 fresh from the replacement depot with an M1 still wrapped in wax paper, was assigned to the southern approach. Flank the hill, recon the backside, and hold position until dawn. Captain Mallory had written it plainly across the briefing board, defend until relieved. They didn't yet know how long that might be. As the squad moved out, Hale caught movement behind the tree line and signaled for the men to drop. Just wind? Maybe. But no one pushed forward alone now. The Germans didn't need to fire. They let the forest do half their killing. The snow picked up as they crept deeper, visibility sinking to inches at times. People back home would never believe that in the middle of a world war, men were dying without seeing their enemy. But that's what the Hurtgen was, an enemy without a face, just shapes in the mist, shadows behind roots, fire that came before sound. Hale motioned for a halt, sliding into the muck beside Corporal Stevens, who whispered, "I feel like I'm already inside a coffin." Hale didn't respond right away. There was something in the quiet, the way that no branches cracked, how even the birds stopped singing. He listened like he used to in the hollers back home, hunting. Something wasn't right. A few paces later, they stumbled on the first signs, body parts, American, blown apart by artillery. Not fresh. Maybe 2 days. Nothing to bury them with. The ground was too hard. Death here got covered up by snow, not ceremony. Then came the first shell. A shriek through the canopy, followed by a concussion that lifted mud in their chests and ears. A tree exploded 20 feet to Hale's left, splinters slicing through the woods, shrapnel ricocheting off helmets. One man went down screaming, blood pouring through his scarf. It wasn't even aimed at them, it was pre-targeted fire, triggered by tripwire sensors or pattern timing. The Germans didn't shoot to kill individual soldiers out here. They shot to erase squads wholesale. Hale grabbed the wounded man's collar, dragging him through soaking pine needles, the bar flung across his chest, nearly tearing the sling in two. They didn't fire back. Couldn't. There was no enemy to shoot at, just noise and chaos from somewhere too far and too close all at once. The entire squad scattered behind stumps, craters, and fallen logs. Rain turned to sleet. One man's radio sparked and died, moisture seeped inside and shorted it. "We've got no comms," someone yelled. Hale's thoughts slammed into the one cold reality they all now faced, they were in it. Deep. And no one was coming anytime soon. For most of the night, they waited in frigid silence, watching the tree lean for figures that may or may not have existed. It wasn't about strategy anymore, it was survival by patience, by instinct. Hale flexed his numb fingers near the chamber of his bar, checking the feed strip, counting ammunition by feel. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew, if the Krauts came at dawn, they'd be outnumbered 10-1. He whispered beneath his breath, not a prayer but something like it. The dawn never fully arrived. Just an ugly, bruised gray leaking through the treetops. Hill 232 lay dead ahead, rising like a clenched fist through the fog, its summit somewhere barely visible through the smear of broken pine. Hale motioned with 2 fingers, and the squad began advancing again, low and fast. That was the last time all 6 of them would walk together. Within an hour, the hill would decide who stood and who bled. And somewhere just beyond sight, another shell was already screaming through the trees, waiting to split everything they knew in half. Captain James Mallory wasn't much for speeches. He wore his rank like an old shirt, familiar and fraying. 43 years old, stoop-shouldered, and nearly deaf in one ear from Anzio. Before the war, he'd taught high school history in Reading, Pennsylvania. Now he was carrying a map case stained with the blood of the lieutenant who had owned it 48 hours earlier. Mallory had a voice like gravel and eyes that saw too far ahead. While others barked commands, he spoke like a man delivering hard news at a funeral. Hale respected that. In this forest, truth was the only thing that didn't rot. They called a halt just shy of the southern tree break below Hill 232. The freezing wind had gone dead still. It was the kind of air that carried whispers too far and gunfire not far enough. Mallory crouched beside a log that oozed with rainwater and unfolded a hand-drawn map, the edges darkened with oil from fingers long dead. "The hill controls the roadway to Wassenack," he muttered, stabbing a gloved finger at the contour lines. "That means it controls the approach to Schmidt. And that means the Krauts want it more than we do." His tone didn't rise, it dropped lower, like he feared the forest could hear him. He glanced sidelong at Hale, who crouched nearby with steam rising off his helmet. "You know what makes a man survive out here?" Mallory asked without waiting for an answer. "Not skill. Not even luck. It's stubbornness. You hunt. Then you know, a big buck don't live 8 winters 'cause he's strong. He lives because he disappears when it counts and fights like hell when he can't." Hale gave a slow nod, the words threading deep into him, tugging something loose. He knew that kind of survival. His own father had lived it with coal-dusted hands and eyes that never blinked at hard choices. Mallory pointed at the contour line again. "I need your squad on that slope. East face. Recognize the terrain, dig in, keep your eyes open. If the enemy starts moving tonight, I'm betting they hit from the northeast. They're feeling us out. Listening." He paused. "They don't know we've spotted them yet." Hale didn't ask how the captain knew. The way Mallory watched the tree lines, like he was reading a diary, was answer enough. Some men wore experience like armor. Mallory wore his like scars. He finished that meeting not with orders, but a warning. They'll test the line before they break it. First with scouts. Then with steel. Then with fire. But they won't test your courage, Sergeant Hale. They'll test your patience. And your quiet. It wasn't ceremony. It was preparation. That mix of steel and sorrow that only men who survived too many marches could still carry without buckling. Hale committed it all to memory. Words mattered more than bullets when death stirred in the branches above. As Mallory turned to go, he reached into the pocket of his greatcoat and tossed Hale a small silver lighter, dented, half-tarnished. "Found it on a Kraut back in Normandy. Doesn't light for long. Just like men. Still, sometimes it's enough." Hale caught it one-handed, said nothing, but ran his thumb across the engraving. A German name, etched in Gothic script, now blackened with soot. He never lit a fire with it that night. But he carried it anyway. And it would be in his pocket when the hill tried to take everything from him. That was the last real conversation he'd have with Captain Mallory. The last time he'd hear that calm voice steady the fear that crept beneath every barked command. Because sometime before dawn, under that churning sky and the weight of trees that leaned like mourners, fate would carve a line between those who would face the morning and those who would feed the soil. And that line was about to move. It started with silence. Not peace, just the sudden absence of distant mortar thumps and machine gun chatter that had haunted the night hours before. That kind of silence made men go still without understanding why. In the early hours of November 12th, Tom Hale crouched beside a blackened tree trunk, watching the mist rise over the ridgeline of Hill 232. Around him, shadows moved, but some of them didn't move back. His squad, once 6 men and growing close despite the strangeness of war's timetable, had shrunk to 4 racked souls and 2 open silence markers in their place. Rain had fallen again before midnight and froze before dawn, turning every ridge into ice-laced death. The radios had gone out after the second burst the night before, and Company B's runners didn't return. Somewhere behind them, Captain Mallory had disappeared into the tree line with his command group and hadn't come back. For all Hale knew, he was still walking somewhere out in that forest, or lying beneath it. The chain of command thinned until nothing was left but instinct and the last clear order Mallory had given: hold the hill. They won't break you if you don't let them see you blink. Hale hadn't blinked once yet, not even after scraping what was left of Private Lindell off the bark of a shattered pine hours earlier. The climb up Hill 232 was short in distance but long in punishment. Pine needles carpeted the slope like wet ice, and exposed roots grabbed at ankles like traps. They moved without words now, using signals learned in drills but sharpened by survival. The trees thinned oddly near the summit, gouged by repeated shellfire and cleared by German engineers months before to create firing lanes. It was there, in the ruined crown of twisted branches, that Hale and the last of his squad established a defense. No trenches, no bunkers, just shallow depressions in the frost-hardened soil and the scent of dirt that smelled like soaked leather and rot. At first light, Hale laid out ammo and rations while his numb joints screamed against the cold. He passed a tin of cold beans to Corporal Stevens, who barely registered the movement. The younger recruit, Phelps, the Kansas boy, trembled beside a tree stump, clutching a photo of someone he hadn't named. The moment cracked when artillery hissed overhead and slammed into the adjacent ridge. Tree burst. Splinters of pine and jagged bark shot through the morning air like daggers. Hale's arm went instinctively to his helmet as a fragment skimmed his shoulder. He turned, called for a head count, but then came the second round. It landed closer. Hale went down, ears ringing, mouth full of needles and grit. When he crawled forward, vision blurred from the concussion shock, he reached for Stevens, but his hand came back slick. Phelps was gone too. No screams. Just gone. Vaporized. One man remained with him now, slumped behind a partial log wall, eyes dazed. Private Reese from Ohio. Born on the 4th of July, quiet, polite, not built for this. He blinked at Hale with gray-tinged eyes like someone tasting death and realizing it had no flavor. And just like that, it was Hale alone. Reese managed 3 shaky breaths before slumping over. Hale didn't touch him. He didn't have to. The body told its own truth. Cold dug into his boots and slowed the fingers he needed to reload. But instinct, steel-honed and coal-thick, took control. He counted the remaining magazines, 6, each half full. His bar was still operational, barrel scratched, strap torn, sights slightly bent from the last dive. It roared every time he pulled the trigger, but it still worked. More importantly, it still barked louder than his heartbeat, and right now, that's all he had to fight with. Up ahead, he saw them, figures moving in the fog-down slope, maybe 6 or 7, German scout team formation, shoulders hunched. He didn't wait. The first 3 fell to chest shots from his bar, the 4th ran for cover. The rest vanished into the frost. It was only a probing attack. A feeler. A test. They'd be back. He dropped behind his tree again, chest heaving in gulps of air laced with cordite. Snow broke loose from a branch and tumbled softly over the edge of his helmet, sticking where the warmth of life still lingered around his ears. His glove was soaked red from where he'd steadied himself on what used to be Reese. But he didn't flinch. Not once. His breathing steadied. His body adjusted to this new, cruel rhythm, the rhythm of a man who understood no one was left to relieve him. The hill hadn't just taken Hale's men. It had taken his route back. There was no radio, no reinforcements, no warm hand on the shoulder to say, "We got you, rest now." Nothing but blood-slick bark, iron smell, and the creeping sound of another footfall in the distance. And once that foot hit the twigs, he'd know it was starting again. What he didn't know yet, even as he loaded another round and wiped the fog from his sightline, was that the Germans weren't done testing. They were preparing something far worse. And Hale would have nowhere left to fall back to, except the place he'd already decided he wouldn't leave. The sleet began again just after noon, turning every inch of soil into a slick mess that clung to Hale's knees each time he shifted behind the shattered tree stump. He'd wedged himself between 2 exposed roots, partially mulched, partially frozen, but deep enough to act as a firing nest. His gloves were stiff, soaked through, and torn at the fingers. What little heat remained was leaching out of his hands faster than he could replenish it. He kept clenching and unclenching his fists, less to move blood and more to stay awake. Fatigue was more dangerous than the next round of incoming. The forest punished stillness with freezing death, and Hale had no plans of dying quiet. The first wave hadn't broken him, but it had rattled the Germans. Hale could hear them now, shouting to each other, uncertain whether a full company was on that hill or just a stubborn few. He had no radio, no flares, and only 15 rounds left in his open magazine. He moved laterally 20 feet across the slope, dragging his bar by the strap he'd hastily tied back together using wire from a blown signal pack. Every time he changed position, he fired a short burst, not to kill, but to deceive. To make them think there were more. So far, it was working. He passed the corpse of Private Reese again, his body lumped near a burnt-out tree base, mouth open like it had been trying to say something he didn't remember. Hale paused, knelt down, and unbuckled the man's web belt. Took 2 canteens, a trench knife, and 5 clips for the M1 Garand, not useful for the bar, but maybe he could barter them with someone. If anyone ever made it up here. He reached into Reese's coat pocket and found a folded letter. He didn't read it, just placed it in his own chest pocket alongside the one from Ezra. Some words are too cold to carry unless you believe they'll see daylight again. Hale wasn't sure this one would. Another probing squad came just after the hour turned, boots crunching slowly through frost-covered needles, hugging the lower tree line. 4 silhouettes, armed with MP-40s and Kar 98 bolts. One carried a radio on his hip, an NCO. Hale let them crawl into the open until the first boots passed a twisted route he'd marked in his mind. Then he fired. Short, controlled. 2 went down instantly. The third screamed and scrambled, only to catch a ricochet in the thigh and vanish behind cover, dragging himself uselessly. The last, radio man, was guts open, legs twitching as his life faded into steam. Hale watched it all through his cracked sight, waiting for breath to steady. Then he moved again. Each exchange made Hale lighter. He was bleeding now, a nick across the top of his left thigh where shrapnel kissed through his wool, but nothing life-threatening. The real damage wasn't visible. It was the kind that came with time. His heartbeat, once tethered to adrenaline, now matched the pulse of the forest, slow, patient, unforgiving. Water dripped onto his helmet in a steady rhythm from a split above. The same cold water that now soaked the back of his coat and filled his boots to the heel. He stopped thinking about home sometime around dusk. Not on purpose. Memory just took longer to reach him now. When the third wave didn't come, he knew they were preparing something. A change in sound carried a heavier weight in war than any trumpet. Less rustle, more metallic. He heard what might have been a tread groaning over damp rock. Flammenpanzer. A German flame tank. He'd seen photos of their work during briefings in the Normandy hedgerows, bunkers turned to crematories, foxholes into pools of bone. There was no way to stop one without armor support or high explosives. Hale had 1 grenade. And it was wet. He pressed himself into the mud, kissed his cheek against frozen bark, and waited. 10 minutes. Maybe 20. Then movement, unnaturally fluid. A shoulder glimpsed through the brush, followed by the low chug of an engine choking in the cold. He wasn't hallucinating. They were bringing fire, and he was alone. The war had thinned him down to the raw layer of will. And now they were going to test just how far that will could burn. He shifted to flank the approach side and waited behind a trio of scattered firs. If they crested the ridge and came blind, he had a narrow chance, 1 shot to knock the infantry cover, 1 to arc the grenade into the treads, and run like hell behind the hill's rear escarpment where a few rocks gave natural interruption. The grenade's safety pin was stiff from sediment. He bit it loose, spat it out like a bone. Footsteps. Muttered German, words he didn't need to translate. A squad coming to mark the ground ahead of their engine. Letting infantry take the hits first before knitting flame through the trees. Hale raised the bar and waited for breath, for clarity, for the moment the forest whispered now. Something deep inside him, older than the war, older than those trees, was winding into place. But it wasn't panic. It was preparation. Because if the tank made it to the hilltop intact, then Hale's name would disappear with everything else on that slope. And in the silence that followed, something new crackled in the air, not just frost, not just flame, but something born from the uncanny stillness of a man who had nothing left to lose. The snow began to melt in scattered patches beneath the heat of fire. Not sunlight, no warmth came from above, but the creeping hisses of thick German-engineered heat pressing slowly up the hill. Hale gripped the frozen receiver of the bar, eyes fixed on the shifting mass between the trees. The Flammenpanzer wasn't pretty. It was squat, black like old coal, with bulbous hatches and steel tubing that hissed fine threads of gas even before it roared to life. And behind it, layered in a staggered file, 12 Germans in winter coats, most with MP-40s, moving with urgent coordination. They weren't probing anymore. This was the real attempt to take 232. He ducked low into his firing position as the first stream of flame burst across the slope. A 30-foot tongue of napalm cut sideways through a thicket near where he'd last fired. Trees screamed when they burned. Hale never knew that before. The pitch of it rose strangely, mixed with the shrill note of sap exploding from pine trunks. The cold no longer mattered. Even the snow was receding in dirty streaks along the ground, curling into black smoke. The forest around him, once his shield, was starting to turn against him. He changed position fast, crawling across a slick of half-melted ice and decayed root to an alternate blind dug deeper into the hillside. Hadn't used it yet, saved for just this. Every part of his body resisted movement now, muscles stiff from cold and tension, but there wasn't time to argue with pain. He slung the bar over the stump wall, adjusted his angle, and waited for the moment that the Germans would fan out. In two-line formation, they'd spread just as they crested high enough and paused to assess what they thought was clear ground. When the fire paused, just for seconds, he moved. 6 rounds burst from the muzzle in sharp staccato. One gunner spun and dropped, another stumbled with a scream that ended just as the bar bucked again. He counted 4 confirmed impacts, 2 neutralized threats, and an opening. The infantry scattered. The tank stopped moving. For a moment, confusion bloomed on their side, and that one hesitation was enough for Hale to relocate again, vanishing downslope into swirling ash and smoke. He didn't dare wait. No soldier stayed in one spot now. The Germans had caught on, the American wasn't a squad. It was just one man. He could hear them shouting in frustration, voices clipped with panic. Nur einer. Just one. They hadn't planned for this. They'd expected to overrun a weakened platoon, not a ghost with a machine rifle and a mountain's worth of resolve. Hale didn't acknowledge the small, jagged satisfaction in that realization. He couldn't afford to. The Flammenpanzer turned its turret again. The hiss built up, then the forest lit in layers of orange and white. Whole sections ignited like dry paper. Another path up the hill disappeared in fire. A chunk of shell-struck tree landed 2 feet beside him, burning. Hale rolled to smother it under his chest, crushing it into wet dirt as it sizzled against his coat. His shoulder screamed in protest. He'd torn something earlier, maybe from the recoil or a fall, but it didn't slow his hands. Drawing the last grenade from his belt, the one he'd saved through frost and silence, he palmed it tightly. It was packed with mud and barely held shape, but still good enough, if it rolled under the right place. More steps. Clearing in his direction. Germans regrouping now, shouting tactical commands, slipping around flanks. They weren't going to climb over a wall of fire, they were going to squeeze him out. Hale blinked sweat from his eyes, which now stung from ash and smoke. He had one more move. One last attempt to change the narrative fast enough that the rest wouldn't matter. If the Germans thought they'd flushed him out, their rear would be weaker, a brief pulse of vulnerability before they organized again. With one choking breath, he lobbed the grenade over a log, letting it bounce noisily just behind the tank's left tread. It didn't explode immediately, and for a second, Hale thought it was a dud. Then it went off like a crack of thunder. Not powerful enough to destroy, but direct against soft belly, enough to blister confusion and drop a man. The fire paused again. Screams cut from confusion into pain. And the tank, for all its might, hissed itself backward into the trees, almost blindly. That's when a second detail emerged that hardened Hale's face even further. Among the Germans still standing, at least one was a Waffen-SS officer. Uniform marked with the double lightning bolts, black collar, frost on his visor cap. This wasn't just a recon squad anymore. It wasn't routine. The SS were employed when objectives were to be held at any cost. And Hill 232, Hale realized now, was more valuable than any of them had been told. That changed things. It meant there would be no surrender. No mercy in retreat. No path open but forward violence. And no help on its way. Whatever happened next would happen with just him and the few bullets he had left. He pressed his back to the wet bark behind him, heart thudding slow and deep like a war drum muffled in snow. The trees were burned now, giving less concealment, and he could feel the German line tightening like a fist. He might hold for another hour. Maybe less. But the worst part wasn't what lay ahead. It was knowing that sometime tonight, when the artillery started again, the Americans wouldn't aim far enough to know he was still alive. And that's when he noticed his father's knife, slipping forward from his belt, soaked in ash, the handle still warm from where he'd clutched it earlier. The same one he held the day he promised he'd bring Ezra home. It was still there. And as long as it was, he would be too. For now. Darkness took the hill slowly, crawling down through the trees like spilled ink, swallowing color, swallowing sound. By the time the sun had fully disappeared behind the ruined ridges of the Hurtgen forest, Hale could no longer see his hand in front of his face. Snow flurries began to fall again, tiny, almost weightless, but they clung with purpose, catching on every scrap of fabric and flake of blood like they meant to bury him where he sat. The bar was down to its last magazine, and his fingers were too stiff to reload quickly now. Every motion came with focus. Every breath turned inward, where it couldn't fog the rifle's sight and give away his position. Somewhere in his thigh, shrapnel had worked deeper. A burning throb shot down into his calf with every heartbeat. He shifted once, felt the muscle seize, and nearly cried out. Swallowing pain became its own kind of discipline. His body was a machine now, rusted and failing, but he couldn't step out of it. This wasn't the kind of pain you could fix, it was the kind that had to be outlasted. And even that plan was failing by degrees. No more German voices came uphill. No more firelight. They were waiting now. Resting, perhaps. Or letting their flame tank circle back, letting hunger and cold do the killing the fire hadn't finished. Hale leaned back into the hollow of the tree that had become his coffin in waiting. Somewhere in the dirt under him were bloodstains from men who no longer had names. He pulled Ezra's letter from his chest pocket, not to read, just to hold it. That softness of paper felt unreal in this world of splintered frozen wood and blasted ribs of trees. Time no longer moved in minutes. It ticked in inches. In the drip of melted sleet from a broken branch. In the scratch of his own breath. In the sharp pressure of frost gathering at the edges of his boots that he could no longer feel. He hadn't eaten since the ration bar yesterday, and his canteen was empty. Inside his chest, his heartbeat had slowed, like even it was unsure the body was worth fighting for anymore. And that's when it came. A voice. Not in German. Not in orders. It was a whisper, his mother's voice. Not real, not really. But it came just the same. Soft. Strong. The way she'd sounded the morning he left, when she pressed the cross into his shirt pocket and gripped his hand as though doing so might keep him from war. Bring him back, she'd said. I don't care what happens to you, Tom, you bring Ezra home. The words hadn't haunted him. Until now. Because the promise was still alive, but he wasn't sure he was. He clenched his jaw against the thought. No. Not yet. Not here. Not without a reason for it. He still had one magazine. One fire left to give. Behind the layers of pain and smoke and frost, there was something refusing to slip away. Something deeper than orders and honor and even family. It was more primitive. A need to not let evil pass without resistance. A need to not let his brothers fall unseen, unavenged. What scared him wasn't dying, it was dying unseen, as if none of it had mattered. Cold finally gave its cruel gift, it numbed his agony just enough for movement. He tightened the sling across his chest and laid flat in the black soil, cheek pressed against the frozen earth. Close enough to hear the push of snow sliding from evergreens nearby. There was movement below. He couldn't see it yet, but it was coming. Not fast. Not rushed. But steady. Purposeful. They were going to take the hill by inches now. And Hale knew that if he let himself pass into sleep, even for a moment, it would not be rest. It would be surrender. The rifle weighed more than it ever had. His body trembled, but the barrel stayed still, trained on ghost outlines in the distance. Behind the mound of frozen needles, shadows shifted. A boot crunched lightly. He exhaled through clenched teeth and tensed his grip. In the panic of hours ago, he had been a weapon. Now, in this silence, he was something else entirely. He was a monument no one had built yet, holding a hill no one would remember. And still, he waited. Because he wasn't done. Not until he spent the last bullet to make them remember. The first step downhill made no sound, and that's what snapped Hale awake. His chin had drooped, just barely, but enough that the cold had started creeping into the base of his neck like it meant to shut everything down. He blinked, pushing himself upright again, heart crashing back into rhythm like a hammer to steel. Shadows moved near a break in the trees, faint lines against the low fire glow of the burning underbrush. He wasn't sure how long he drifted, but it didn't matter. Night had swallowed the hill whole, and death came quiet now. That's when it hit him. A memory, sharp, unshakable, from a winter night deep in the West Virginia mountains long before the army ever had his name. He was 13, scoping deer through brush coated with ice, stomach growling from too tight a winter. His daddy, rifle in hand beside him, whispered what mattered most. A good hunter don't chase. He waits. Patience don't just save bullets, it saves lives. In the silence that wrapped Hale now, those words didn't feel like memory. They felt like map and compass. The Germans weren't hunting anymore. They were sweeping, like sheepdogs closing a wide loop. They weren't expecting pressure. They were expecting surrender. And that, suddenly, was his edge. He didn't need to lay here clinging to the hill like it was sacred ground. He could move. He could shift. Not recklessly, not into their fire, but smart. Like back home. Create sound that wasn't real. Shift brush with rocks. Fire in short bursts from different angles. Trick them into thinking the line still held. If he did it right, he wouldn't need strength, only timing and knowledge. It wasn't combat anymore. It was hunting. Only now, the prey wore black coats and steel helmets. Hale gritted his teeth and pulled his last full mag from his belt with trembling fingers. He crawled downslope 15 yards, every movement grinding wet leaves against the metal of his bar. When he reached cover beside a twisted pine trunk, he took aim at nothing, just empty fog, and fired 2 bursts. Then, fast as his body allowed, he slid sideways to another cluster of deadfall and clicked a dry branch under his boot, loud and deliberate. From below, he heard voices, short, urgent. Someone barked, _vi dort. Wir man, _2 up there, for men. They still believed it was more than one. That belief was his shield now, thin as it was. He pulled out a rock and tossed it hard over his shoulder into the ruins of a burned-out foxhole. The noise echoed just enough. Another gunburst snapped in reply from the German side, into nothing. They were firing blind. Panicking. He couldn't do this forever. But if he could hold the illusion long enough for rotation, long enough for command to realize the hill hadn't been taken. Movement again, closer this time. A pair of boots climbing surge style, cautious. Not charging. He slid behind the stump, hands slippery but steady enough as he lined up his sights. The figure stepped across a shaft of firelight, but just as he squeezed the trigger, the form turned. Young. Too young. Hale hesitated. Just for one heartbeat. The boy couldn't be more than 16. A Volkssturm conscript, likely dragged from a schoolhouse in Cologne. That hesitation nearly cost him. The second soldier beside the youth fired toward his muzzle flash. The shot missed, but barely. Pine bark exploded at Hale's shoulder, and he dove instinctively to the right, shoulder catching the raw edge of a frozen log. Breath gone. Ribs screamed. He pulled himself along the mud and unleashed the rest of the magazine downhill, not aiming but driving them back with sheer noise. When the rifle clicked dry, he lay still, chest heaving, ears ringing again. The youth was gone. At least, for now. His hands trembled as he reloaded. But it wasn't fear. Something else was driving him now, something past the breaking point. Something deeper than duty. He thought again of Ezra. The promise. Not just survival, the return. He saw his brother's kid grin, the same one from that creek photo, and somehow the shrapnel in his thigh didn't bite as hard. The hunger faded. He pulled the harmonica from his inner pocket, still muddy, but not crushed. Clenched it in one bloodied palm. If they wanted this hill, they were going to have to climb through one last mountain man. And he still had one more trick left. The final push came not with the roar of tank treads or the blaze of flamethrowers, but with footsteps. Careful, deliberate. Synchronized and close. The Germans had finally decided to finish what they started. Hale lay motionless under his tree ledge, tucked into a pocket of earth barely deep enough to shelter half his spine. His body had stopped aching hours ago, numbed by cold, pain, fatigue, or maybe something else. Something that crossed the threshold between life and endurance. He could feel them closing in now, less than 30 yards off. The snow wasn't falling anymore. Even the sky held its breath. He clenched the harmonica tighter in one hand while his other hovered over the trigger of the bar. Only 4 rounds left, and he wouldn't waste them. They'd already bought him more time than any command strategy ever had. His plan had worked, confused patrols, scattered movements, delayed the advance. Even if just long enough. Because somewhere beyond these trees, another American unit was moving. He could almost feel the weight of fresh boots hitting the frosted ground to the west. If his illusion held for just a few more minutes, there'd be enough time for someone else to live. A twig snapped 10 feet to his left. His head turned slowly, each motion aching, but he didn't lift the barrel yet. A figure emerged through the charred brush. Rifle up. Freeze-frame breath visible between pale lips. Not shouting. Not charging. He wore an SS field cap, black and slick with meltwater. His right eye was swollen shut. The man scanned the hilltop like he didn't trust what he was seeing. Just corpses, ash, and one man too filthy to even recognize as alive. Hale didn't move. He knew when to stay still better than most men knew when to breathe. The officer approached, cautiously, stepping across the flattened positions of Hale's fallen squad. His boot nudged a torn helmet, paused, then kept going. 10 feet. Then 6. Then 4. Hale didn't blink. His finger tensed against steel. The man glanced toward him suddenly, but there must have been something in Hale's eyes. Something feral. Something ancient. Because the officer didn't fire. He just looked. And for a heartbeat, both men stared at each other through the cracked glass of war. Two predators, too tired, too human, too far gone to lift the blade. Then came the screaming. Boots. American voices. Up the ridge, move, move. Shadows rushed through the tree-line. M1s raised. The SS officer turned to run, but Hale fired the last 4 rounds, 3 missed wide. The 4th struck the man in the back of the leg and dropped him into the black snow. Hale didn't celebrate. He just exhaled. Soldiers swarmed the hilltop in a wave of breath and gunpowder. Shouts layered across new noise, medics, officers, boots clattering on rock. A young GI dropped beside Hale, stunned. Jesus! Someone get a litter. He's alive. Hands were on Hale's shoulders. Warm ones. Real ones. They touched his chest, checked his eyes, broke open a morphine syringe, then paused when a medic spotted the rifle. Who the hell did he hold this whole sector? Another voice above them, uncertain. We thought this ridge was lost. Hale tried to speak, lips cracked, blood mixed with mud. No sound came. Just the slow rise of his chest. He was lifted, barely, gently, onto a stretcher. The forest rotated above him as they carried him downhill, trees blurring past like memories he couldn't place in order. Someone said his name. Maybe more than once. He didn't know if he answered. He was asleep before they reached the tree line. 3 days later, Thomas Hale woke up inside a field hospital near Hurtgen. His leg was still there. Just barely. So was the harmonica, tucked inside a flask pocket. They told him his entire squad was confirmed Kia. Captain Mallory's tags had been recovered. Word of his defense of Hill 232 spread quietly at first, then louder. By January, officers from V Corps were calling him the Ghost of the Ridge. They never found out exactly how many Germans he killed, but intercepted intelligence later revealed an SS radio transmission that read, _resistance position held against presumed American squad. Map unclear. Possible ambush site. Heavy losses. Unconfirmed number of defenders _. They never knew it was just one man. Thomas Hale never returned to combat. His body wouldn't allow it, and neither would his eyes. He spent the rest of the war in a hospital bed outside Paris, then a VA rehab center in Baltimore. He spoke little of what happened. Not because he wanted to forget, but because so many others didn't come back with tongues to speak their half of the story. In July 1945, he returned to Rodell, West Virginia. Ezra was there, wearing a shipyard worker's uniform, older now, with calluses where innocence used to be. They didn't hug at first. Just stared at each other across the train platform like brothers who'd both survived separate wars. It was their mother who finally pulled them together. Years passed. The hill became a number in a report. The war became a chapter behind glass. But one tree still stood at the top of Hill 232, its trunk split from flame but clinging to life through the decades. And carved faintly into its bark, weathered by ice and wind, were 3 letters. T-H-E. They never built a monument for Thomas Hale. He wouldn't have wanted one. Because he knew, as the forest knew, that sometimes the greatest acts of courage leave behind no statue, no ceremony, just a scar on the land and the memory of a man too stubborn to leave it behind. And in the still silence of that hill, when the snow falls just right, you can almost hear a harmonica, playing low, for no one.